Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hermeneutics matters. This is the somewhat provocative thesis of the talk that I will be giving to you today on the famous debate between Feinstein and Waldenberg on the topic of abortion. This is the first opportunity for me to present this thesis to a distinguished audience of experts, and to do so in English, since my dissertation is written in German. So I am very curious about your reactions. It was during the 1970s that two of the world's greatest Orthodox rabbis took up two decidedly different points of view on the matter of abortion. Moshe Feinstein, the so-called Igrot Moshe, and Eliezer Waldenberg, or Tzitz Eliezer. Within Judaism, their respective positions remain essential to this day. Feinstein stresses that abortion, being nothing else than murder, is strictly prohibited. There's only one exception: to save the mother's life. Waldenberg, on the contrary, also emphasizes the general prohibition of abortion, but not on the grounds of murder being forbidden. In fact, he allows for numerous exceptions, and not only in order to directly save the mother's life. My analysis of their contrary positions was based on these leading questions. How do Jewish Orthodox decision makers, poskim, arrive at their positions, piskei halakha? Which facts play a role in rendering judgment? How are these facts weighed and balanced against each other? Why do there remain such big differences, even among contemporaneous poskim of the same stream? Which hermeneutics underlie their decisions, either explicitly or implicitly? In order to get a hold of this, I started by consulting the most important halakhic sources on this issue and translated them into German while also commentating on them. The underlying halakhic primary sources, some of which we just heard some words about them, as well as the most important responsa by Feinstein and Waldenberg on this topic. Following this, I produced a thorough analysis of these texts, proceeding in 3 steps. First, I ascertained the halakhic assumptions. In a second step, I worked out the ethical concretions or specific rulings. And finally, I examined various hermeneutical background assumptions. More on that just in a moment. The traditional approach, customary in Orthodox Judaism in order to account for these differences, is the following. The halakhic basic decisions are fundamental. That is, they lay out the path for the specific ethical or legal rulings, in Hebrew, piskei halakha. To give an example, Feinstein considers pregnancy termination to be murder, and thus as strictly forbidden by the Torah, de-oraita. Waldenberg, by contrast, holds it to be a rabbinical prohibition, de-rabbanan. Abortion, therefore, does not fall under the prohibition of murder, but is specified by Waldenberg as either the prohibition of destruction of human seed or the prohibition of unlawful wounding. According to the traditional interpretation, these diverse halakhic regulations have a direct impact on the specific decisions. If abortion is murder, as Feinstein sees it, then it can only be permitted in order to save the life of the mother. However, if, as Waldenberg holds it, is a prohibition de-rabbanan, then there's more wiggle room for him to find grounds of permission. For instance, when the mother is suffering, either mentally or physically, in addition, reasons pertaining to the fetus itself, such as in the case of severe disability, or even to siblings, may be taken into consideration. Feinstein wants to prevent pregnancy termination as much as possible, which is why, in his view, they should be undertaken as late as possible. Waldenberg, in turn, argues that if they must be carried out, then this should be best done as early as possible. According to this traditional Jewish Orthodox interpretation, the various ethical and legal concretions, piskei halakha, derive directly and exclusively from the halakhic basic decisions. Hermeneutical background assumptions do not play a role in arriving at a decision. As a supplement to this, I propose an extended analytical approach, which explicitly takes the hermeneutical background assumptions into consideration as well. Among the hermeneutical background assumptions, by way of example, are the following: scriptural hermeneutics, such as the selection, weighting, and interpretation of halakhic sources, and textual criticism, as well as the engagement with contrary positions. Also, general attitudes towards physicians, the image of God and the self-image as a posek, and rhetorical peculiarities. Okay, I'll skip that. What I want to focus on today is the different ways in which Feinstein and Waldenberg deal with textual criticism. Feinstein makes numerous text-critical adjustments to some of his sources. For instance, as early as 1935, he argued that there was a scribe's mistake in a specific Tosfot text. Even though it says there that it is, quote, permitted to kill the fetus, unquote, the Tosfot, according to Feinstein, held it that in fact it is prohibited. And that whoever does it in spite of that is merely exempt from the capital punishment that would be upon him in principle. So, by mere accident, a mistaken scribe supposedly wrote permitted, Hebrew mutar, instead of exempt, Hebrew patur. In later responsa, while the debate with Waldenberg was reaching its climax, Feinstein discarded an entire responsum by the Maharit. Since it says there in number 97 that abortion is prohibited, but in number 99 that it is rather permitted, Feinstein concluded that this second answer, quote, surely must have been forged by some erring student, unquote. Waldenberg rejects Feinstein's text-critical deletions vehemently. He does, however, recognize that this Tosfot text is in fact a difficult one, but he emphatically insists on interpreting the text as it is, without making any changes to it. As far as Maharit is concerned, Waldenberg advances a proposal for how both number 97 and 99 can be explained without any deletions. All he does is merely to rearrange the order of the paragraphs in the two responsa. It is also instructive to see how Feinstein and Waldenberg interpret or reinterpret texts that contradict their own points of view. In the case of Feinstein, it is more appropriate to speak of a reinterpretation of opinions that are contrary to his own. On the Achiezer, he writes, if only he had seen the words of the Rabbi Chaim Halevi, he, the Achiezer, would have taken exactly the opposite point of view. His readings of Ramban is striking too. With the help of a Kal Vachomer argument, Feinstein seeks to prove that Ramban considered the killing of the embryos of fetuses to be prohibited by the Torah, de-oraita, even though Ramban did not in fact write that. Feinstein also interprets Yavetz completely contrary to his own asserted intention. Yavetz claimed that, quote, there is an aspect to alleviating abortion, unquote. Feinstein takes to mean that there are, quote, several aspects to prohibiting it, unquote. With this move, Feinstein departs from the usual interpretations of technical halakhic terms and ascribes to the Yavetz the very opposite of his actual view. Waldenberg does, in fact, engage critically with contrary opinions and also rejects them with some rhetorical flavor, but he does not interpret them in a way that is contrary to their own asserted intentions. When it comes to the Tay-Sachs disease, we are, according to Waldenberg, dealing with a new precedence. The condition is extremely serious, he says, and cannot be diagnosed until late in the pregnancy. And therefore, in this tragic case, late-term abortions ought to be permitted until at least at the 7th month. This time span is not mentioned in the halakhic sources, a fact which Feinstein also criticizes. Waldenberg, however, is convinced other poskim who prohibited abortions after the 3rd month or after the noticiability of fetal movements would in fact have allowed them, had today's possibilities of prenatal diagnosis been available to them. Okay, for time reasons, I'm going to skip the differences in the attitude displayed towards physicians, as well as the differences in the image of God and self in an image as poskim. By way of conclusion, let me say something about the complexity of rendering judgment. As we have seen, Feinstein employs methods of textual criticism and of reinterpretation contrary positions that are highly unusual. This has also been pointed out repeatedly by Jewish Orthodox researchers. At the end of the seminal responsum, one can surmise why Feinstein is so vehemently opposed to abortions. Quote, "I have written all this on the topic of the big loophole within the world where the governments of many countries permit the killing of embryos, fetuses, including the government of the State of Israel. And countless embryos and fetuses have already been killed, thus still making it necessary in our days to erect a fence around the Torah and not to rule leniently in the strongest prohibition of murder." Unquote. If abortions are truly a case of the prohibition of murder, then it would be unnecessary to erect a fence around the Torah, since murder is strictly prohibited anyway. As a detailed hermeneutical analysis shows, however, Feinstein puts his entire weight as a world-renowned scholar, as a posek hador, into the balance here, in order to reject less strict approaches and to prevent further abortions from happening. To reach his goal, he even goes so far as to depart from the hermeneutical foundations of interpreting halakhic sources as they are usually employed in the halakha. The sheer complexity of arriving at decisions can also be studied in the case of Waldenberg. Since pregnancy termination, in his point of view, is prohibited de-rabbanan, he is in a position to allow them in many cases. In one special case, however, Waldenberg adopts the reverse position. He describes the fate of an expectant mother suffering from cancer. The doctors believe that her time to live will be shortened by her continuing the pregnancy. But she wants to have her baby at all costs. Waldenberg reflects upon his role as a posek and admits that, in line with his previous decision-making practice, he should be obligated to recommend a termination of pregnancy, so as to save the mother's life. In this specific case, however, he relies on a tradition of interpretation which he normally used to reject, and for the very reason that it strictly prohibits termination of pregnancy at all costs. The last paragraph. Quote, But it is sometimes that the case that a severe word may bring help and rescue. If in this special tragic case we wish to draw on Beit Shlomo and Avnei Tzedek and all the rest of them who take the hard line and who rule that you do not make an abortion even with the mother's life at risk, we may decide to heed the woman's begging and remain passive and trust in the mercy of heavens and grant her to complete the pregnancy." Unquote. The fact that Waldenberg here decides to heed the woman's begging might have something to do with the fact that he regularly spent time at the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem and maintained close contact to doctors and patients there. The second interpretation, which also takes the hermeneutical background assumptions into account, therefore allows for more nuanced conclusions with regard to how the poskim arrive at an ethical and halakhic decision in a given case, and which factors they take into consideration and how they end up weighing them. In the case I just told you about, Waldenberg gave more weight to the wishes of the woman than he did to his usual halakhic basic assumption. And so we may conclude that sometimes, at least, the path of the decision-making can lead from the specific decision towards an appropriate halakhic regulation. Hermeneutics matters. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Melanie. Very, very interesting. Very interesting.